Nintendo is not known for mature games. Indeed, for decades now, gamers have described them as a company for children, producing titles such as Super Mario Bros., Animal Crossing, and Kirby, all which lean into a cartoonish art style and are often labeled as E for everyone. A lot of that changed with Eternal Darkness. Eternal Darkness, Sanity's Requiem, launched on the GameCube in 2002. Developed by Silicon Knights and directed by Dennis Dyack, the game featured similar gameplay mechanics to that of the classic Resident Evil franchise, though its focus was less on survival and more on unleashing terror. Fans of my videos may find Dyack's name familiar, as I've already spoken about him during my very first horror game review. To learn more about his early career, I encourage you to watch my video on Blood Omen, Legacy of Kain. Eternal Darkness was the very first Nintendo title to be published under the leadership of then-President Satoru Iwata. This is fitting, it seems, as Iwata was known as a maverick of the gaming industry, always willing to take risks and face a challenge head-on. It was under Iwata that Nintendo ditched the successful Game Boy for the DS brand and deserted traditional controls for the innovative motion controls of the Wii. Nintendo publishing its first mature title seems the perfect way to start his illustrious career as Nintendo president. When powering on the game, the first thing that greets you is an apt quote from literary icon Edgar Allan Poe. A passage from his classic poem, The Raven. The piece reads,
"Deep into that darkness peering, long I stood there, wondering, fearing, doubting."
It's a foreboding, haunting excerpt, proficiently capturing the sinister mood of the game, while still adding a touch of class as well. It's with these words that the player is already informed that they are about to experience a horror title unlike any other. Next, the player is met with an extremely creepy opening that in no shape or form correlates with the family-friendly brand of Nintendo. A low droning hum is heard, while glimpses of horrific scenes flash upon the screen, screaming skulls, demonic symbols, wriggling maggots, and tools caked with blood. Interspersed with these images are visions of the far reaches of space, wherein dwells the most distant and ancient of horrors. The game's plot is heavily inspired by the works of H.P. Lovecraft, best known today for inventing the Cthulhu mythos. The evils you encounter in Eternal Darkness are, like Lovecraft's creations, far older than most of the cosmos. Their intentions, nay, their very forms, are incomprehensible to the human mind. Attempting to understand them will only result in crippling madness, having one's mind tortured forever by the unknown. This, I fear, is a fate far worse than any quick, gruesome death. Madness is a major component of Eternal Darkness. Perhaps the game's most notable feature is the Sanity Meter. Whenever your character encounters a monster or witnesses a horrific event, they take a hit to their sanity and slowly slip closer to lunacy. As you become ever more manic, the game will begin to play tricks on you, making you question what's real and what isn't. Sometimes this will simply mean hearing voices and other such noises that aren't there, or maybe envisioning blood dripping from the ceiling as if from a leaky faucet. Other times, though, you may enter a room and find it completely turned upside down, or go to heal yourself, only for it to backfire and you abruptly meet a false death. Some of the greatest frights in the game come in the guise of your hardware acting as if it's malfunctioning. Occasionally the volume will turn itself down to nothing, forcing you to temporarily play in silence, or the screen will fill with realistically rendered cockroaches scurrying about. For gamers, perhaps the most upsetting occurrence is the message that your file has become corrupted when you go to save. You'll sit there in a mild panic, heart racing, thinking about all that wasted time and effort, only for the screen to blink and everything has returned to its normal state. You can, fortunately, recover your sanity by using some items, casting regenerative spells, or executing enemies when they are low on health. It's in this way that the game encourages you to tough out difficult fights instead of running away. This is an interesting gameplay dilemma. If you don't confront your greatest fears willingly, the game just may force you into an unpredictable situation that is far more dire. When Eternal Darkness released, the sanity effects were pioneering, so much so that Nintendo infamously patented the technique, only to never utilize it again. Gamers may have heard that the game plays tricks on you, but until you actually experience it, it's hard to accurately state its effectiveness. In 2002, though, I can undoubtedly say that it worked in delivering true fear to gamers unlike anything they had experienced before. Since then, other games have found ways to mimic this style without blatantly copying it. It's far less effective in the year 2021 as it was in 2002. Still, it's a novel concept, one worth experiencing at least once, but is a feature that sadly hasn't aged as well as the rest of the title. Thus, while many will point to the Sanity Meter as one of Eternal Darkness's greatest strengths, I think that today it's by far outperformed by the expert use of sound, the mind-bending plot, and its robust yet approachable combat style. Players begin the game assuming the role of Alexandra Roivas, a girl away at university in the year 2000, when she learns that her grandfather and only living relative, Edward Roivas, has been found murdered. Alex rushes home to the family estate in Rhode Island and is met with a crime scene far more sinister than she could imagine. His corpse lay in a pool of blood, his head missing. Time passes, and after 2 weeks, the case has gone cold. No leads, no motive, no explanations. Haunted by such a bizarre mystery, Alex decides that she is not returning to school or even leaving the old mansion until she uncovers what exactly happened to her grandfather, even if it kills her. Within minutes, players are left alone to explore the lonely, vacant manor. As Alex, you'll find that most rooms are locked, and those that do allow you inside contain mysterious puzzles that can't quite be solved. This is a staple of the survivor horror genre that Eternal Darkness gets right to a T. You'll be immediately lost, questioning where to go, only to be led down a breadcrumb trail to your next clue. If you've enjoyed escape rooms in recent years, then you'll be right at home here. It's not before long that you'll uncover a secret room in the back of the abode that contains the ominous book, The Eternal Darkness. This tome, bound by flesh and woven together with hair, teeth, and sinew, tells the story of an ancient horror, one that has terrorized mankind for millennia, and could very well spell out the doom for all civilization. Only one chapter of this tale remains intact, however, with the other pages torn out and dispersed across the mansion. As Alex reads each chapter, the player embodies the protagonist of said piece, and must live out the scenario transcribed within. This is perhaps the game's greatest strength. Players are never one character for long, but instead possess nearly a dozen characters from all over the globe and even across time, ranging from a Roman centurion in 26 BC to a military firefighter in the Gulf War to even a monk during the Spanish Inquisition. Through these characters, players will explore 4 major locales and experience their drastic changes across the centuries. Eternal Darkness deals with the inevitable survival horror mechanic of backtracking in a marvelous way by shifting time periods and changing characters, Other games force players to roam through the same areas over and over again, collecting items and solving puzzles to access new locations, and Eternal Darkness is ultimately no different, but the game alleviates the burden of repetition by splitting things up and moving time by hundreds of years. For instance, you may notice a door that cannot be opened during one chapter, only to discover the means to unlock it in a separate chapter set several centuries in the future. Not only are the environments altered in appearance, but each character feels decidedly different from one another as well. Thus the game continues to feel somewhat fresh, even hours into the adventure. Because each of the protagonists inhabit a unique period of time, they will each have at their disposal different types of weaponry in which to defend themselves. Some characters will cleave demons with axes and swords, while others will fire upon these otherworldly terrors with shotguns and even semi-automatic rifles. It's not just the weaponry that is different either. Some characters are much older or less experienced, so everything from their running speed to combat prowess and amount of health are all specific to each independent character. Combat has a surprising amount of depth for how simplistic it is on first appearance. Compared to most other survival horror games, defeating enemies in Eternal Darkness is much more approachable, with far less focus on simulation. Pressing the attack button with a melee weapon will allow the character to unleash a short combo that will wound their foe and often knock them to the ground. In most cases, though, you will want to cleave off parts of an enemy's body to prevent them from attacking or aid in your escape. Targeting the arms of a creature, for instance, will keep them from unleashing many of their attacks, while severing their head will render them blind if it doesn't kill them altogether. These tactics are an excellent form of crowd control, as several times during the adventure you'll be surrounded by hordes of menacing demons, thus crippling them in any manner is often the only way to make it out alive. It's unfortunate that there isn't a way to block or dodge attacks, as the combat here lends itself well to an extra means of defending yourself. I would love to see implemented the ability to duck under a deadly swing of a claw, or parry a murderous swipe by blocking at just the right moment. As it is, most of your defensive measures come in the form of crippling body parts or simply running away. With that being said, wounding the arms and head also doesn't seem to be enough, as crippling the legs feels oddly absent in this scenario. As for the horrors you will be facing, the game is a little light on variety, but what is there offers enough of a challenge to always keep you on your toes. You'll most commonly encounter zombies that lurch towards the player with aggression and attack using their long, bony limbs. These are all rather weak, but can really be a threat when part of a large horde. Trappers are small scorpion-like critters that will warp the player to another dimension if they are hit by a short-range blast of energy. In these warped areas, gamers will have to figure out a small puzzle and possibly battle other menacing creatures in order to reach the exit back to the real world. Bone thieves are thin, sinister creatures that disguise themselves in the skin of other living beings. Once their host is slain, they spring into the open and attempt to slice the player apart with their mantis-like appendages. Of course, there are others, including hulking beasts simply named horrors, and a few bosses that stand in the way of the player in victory, but most others are few and far between. Eternal Darkness does have a large emphasis on spellcasting, a mechanic that's quite unusual in the survival horror genre. This shouldn't be all that surprising though, considering the plot dives into the occult and old black magics.
And that's magic with a CK.
Your spells can come in real handy against some of the game's most vicious of beasts. You can enchant your weapons to do more damage, create a shield that protects against attacks, generate a barrier that harms those that try to pass, and even summon other creatures to do your bidding. Magic isn't only used in battle, though, but is essential to solving many of the game's numerous puzzles. Sometimes you will find several parts of a broken item and need to cast a spell to repair it. Other times you will need to cast a spell to reveal invisible objects or enemies. This combination of using magic both inside and outside of combat keeps it from feeling like a gimmick, but part of the game's greater lore and world. There are some enemies that cast their own spells that you will need to contend with. I particularly liked these rare skirmishes, as it can feel like a true battle of the wits, like two old wizards duking it out with all of their ancient magics. All of your spells can be modified to belong to one of 3 schools, and powered up several levels. Early in the game, players must make a choice between one of the 3 elder gods, represented by the colors red, blue, and green. Depending on your choice, there will be slight differences over the course of the game, primarily in which of these evil deities the majority of enemies will represent. The enemies themselves won't be any different, but they may be stronger or weaker to certain types of spells depending on the color. The player may also notice a very slight difference in the amount of health, mana, or their attack power depending on their choice, though I felt that this was minuscule and didn't have much effect on the game as a whole. I like the idea of choosing between the 3 gods and having to finish the game 3 times to achieve the true ending, but it's not executed all that well. Again, enemies don't change based on your choice, which is a real missed opportunity. Imagine if there were 3 distinct pools of creatures that you encounter based on your initial choice. It would be a ton of work to develop, but would extend the life of the game tremendously. Puzzles are only slightly different, the only real change being the school of spell you will need to cast. For example, in one playthrough, you may need to remove a barrier by the god represented by the color blue, and another by the god colored red, and so on. It really discredits how well the game deals with repetition by having each playthrough virtually the same, the only reward being to see a small cinematic that's not essential to the enjoyment of the game. It's a prize that's far too little considering the amount of work that it entails.
This isn't really happening!
The sound design in Eternal Darkness deserves top merits. Every locale you visit is filled with all the little noises that make the hair stand up on the back of your neck. Just when you think you're alone, you may hear the creaking of a door opening or the hushed whispers of some unseen terror. It keeps you consistently second-guessing yourself, a common theme of the game. Whenever you do fall deeper into madness, the sound is replaced with a more sinister audio track that's truly bone-chilling. You'll begin to hear sobbing from an unknown source, then screams, and finally maniacal laughter. Occasionally, the wail of a baby can be heard, though of course there is never one present. If you happen to be playing with headphones on, then these sounds are certain to give you a scare even greater than what's ever shown on screen. Music, too, is entirely memorable. You wouldn't guess it based on what I've said thus far, but there are many skillfully crafted themes that may actually deserve a place on your playlist. One song, heard during a lengthy battle in the Middle East, is up-tempo and almost perfect to dance to. Another tune that plays when roaming the halls of the Roivas estate as one of Alex's ancestors will have you tapping your foot while you cautiously explore the abode. The strangest thing is that all of this works in a bizarre way and never really comes out of left field. Even a techno-infused song encountered late in the game feels oddly appropriate, largely because it's all so well done. Lastly, the voice cast is also remarkable, with a large portion of them veterans in the field and have worked on the Metal Gear and Legacy of Kain series of games. Jennifer Hale convincingly portrays Alexandra, while other standouts include Cam Clark, Michael Bell, Paul Eiding, David Hayter, Earl Bowen, Richard Doyle, and Greg Eagles. It's a who's who of some of the best voice actor talent from the late 90s and early 2000s, and like the rest of the sound design, they really help sell the entire experience. Eternal Darkness: Sanity's Requiem has sadly never seen a release outside of the Nintendo GameCube. Silicon Knights had planned work on a sequel, but after several failed games and a costly court battle with Epic Games, the studio closed in 2013. DIAC would attempt to crowdfund for a spiritual successor, titled Shadow of the Eternals, but it too ultimately failed despite fan interest, and again, largely to legal troubles. In the summer of 2020, the US Patent and Trademark Office declared Nintendo's trademark of the game abandoned, although Nintendo did quickly renew it a month later, retaining a small amount of hope that we will see the game rise again in some form one day soon. Eternal Darkness is a game that's not just a must-play for fans of horror, but it's integral to understanding the workings of Nintendo during the GameCube era. It was an attempt by the company to step outside of their comfort zone, to carve out a place amongst more mature gamers that were often associated with the Xbox and PlayStation and even Sega brands. And in many ways, they did succeed, just maybe not in the way that they wanted. Eternal Darkness now is viewed somewhat as a cult game, in more ways than one, and it's more than worthy of deserving your attention. Just don't blame me if after playing it you begin to hear and see things that aren't quite there.